In the early years of World War II, German soldiers marched across Europe with a confidence few armies in history had ever known. Poland had fallen in weeks. France, the great military power of the First World War, collapsed in just 40 days. To the men of the Wehrmacht, these victories were not luck. They were proof that Germany had perfected modern warfare. Proof that discipline, obedience, and experience mattered more than numbers or wealth. Inside German barracks, mess halls, and command tents, one belief was shared almost universally. No army on earth could match them. And when the topic of American soldiers came up, it was usually followed by laughter. To most German troops, America felt unreal, a distant land across the ocean, a country of factories, movies, jazz music, and advertisements, a place where people lived comfortably, ate well, and had never known the fear of enemy bombers overhead. German soldiers believed war shaped men, and Americans, they thought, had never been shaped by war at all. German officers openly dismissed the idea of American combat strength. In their minds, real soldiers were forged through hardship, tradition, and strict hierarchy. The American army, they believed, lacked all three. American democracy itself was seen as a weakness. German doctrine taught that soldiers must obey without hesitation, without debate. Yet Americans elected their leaders. They questioned authority. They valued individual freedom. To German commanders, this was proof that American soldiers would hesitate under pressure, argue instead of obey, and fall apart when things went wrong. Among ordinary German troops, stereotypes flourished. They mocked American soldiers as rich boys playing at war, men who chewed gum instead of sharpening discipline, men who talked loudly, laughed easily, and treated officers like equals. Germans believed such behavior showed softness, a lack of seriousness incompatible with survival on the battlefield. Letters sent home from German soldiers reflected this arrogance. Americans were described as factory soldiers, mass-produced by industry rather than hardened by experience. German troops believed Americans relied on machines because they lacked courage. Tanks, planes, trucks, these were seen as substitutes for skill, not tools of it. Nazi propaganda strengthened these beliefs daily. Newspapers and radio broadcasts portrayed Americans as greedy capitalists fighting only for money. Hollywood culture was mocked as evidence of moral weakness. Racial propaganda painted America as divided and unstable, claiming its soldiers would lack unity and purpose. German intelligence reports often reinforced what commanders wanted to hear. American training was dismissed as inadequate. Officers confidently claimed American soldiers would panic under artillery fire, retreat once casualties mounted, and collapse without rigid leadership. There was also a deep cultural misunderstanding. German soldiers had grown up with military tradition. Many had fathers who fought in the First World War. They were raised to see war as duty, sacrifice, and destiny. Americans, by contrast, were believed to fight temporarily. Tourists in uniform who would return home once the danger became real. Inside the Wehrmacht, the belief took hold that even if America entered the war fully, it would take years before its army posed a serious threat. Years Germany believed it did not need. This confidence became complacency. German troops joked that Americans would arrive late, unprepared, and afraid. They believed American soldiers would crumble without strict discipline. They believed wealth had softened them. They believed comfort had weakened their spirit. But beneath this arrogance lay a fatal flaw. German soldiers were judging an enemy they did not understand through ideology, propaganda, and assumption. They mistook unfamiliar behavior for weakness. They mistook optimism for naivety. They mistook flexibility for lack of discipline. As German units prepared defenses in North Africa, Italy, and Western Europe, few believed the American soldier would truly test them. Fewer still believed he would endure. They were wrong. Very wrong. Because soon, the image Germany had built of the American soldier, a soft, untested, overconfident enemy, would collide with reality. And when that collision came, it would not arrive quietly. It would arrive with artillery fire, engines roaring, and soldiers who did not fight the way Germany expected at all. When German soldiers finally came face to face with American troops, it did not happen in the places they expected. It did not begin in the streets of Berlin or the fields of France. It began under the burning sun of North Africa, where dust choked the air and every mistake was paid for in blood. At first, everything seemed to confirm German beliefs. Early encounters with American units were chaotic. Some American formations hesitated. Others advanced too boldly and paid the price. German officers observed these moments carefully and nodded to themselves. There it is, they thought, inexperience. Letters were written home describing Americans as clumsy, poorly coordinated, and naive. For a brief moment, German confidence felt justified. But that moment did not last. What confused German soldiers most was not American weakness. It was American behavior under pressure. German troops expected panic. They expected disorder to spread and units to collapse. Instead, something strange happened. American units absorbed losses, pulled back, reorganized, and returned. Not days later, sometimes hours later. And when they returned, they did not come alone. They came with artillery. German veterans later recalled the first time American guns opened fire in full coordination. The shelling did not drift or wander. It landed suddenly, precisely, and relentlessly. Positions that had felt secure moments earlier became death traps. German soldiers realized that American artillery was not just powerful, it was fast. Fire missions were called in quickly, adjusted efficiently, and repeated without hesitation. Then came the aircraft. American planes appeared overhead with alarming regularity. German troops, once used to operating freely during daylight, now learned to freeze when engines roared above them. Supply trucks were destroyed. Reinforcements were delayed. Wounded soldiers lay exposed as skies filled with enemy aircraft. What shocked German soldiers was not just the firepower, it was the coordination. Americans did not fight like Europeans. They did not rely on slow, deliberate maneuvers. They attacked with combined force. Infantry advanced, knowing artillery and air support stood behind them. If one attack failed, another followed. If one unit broke, another replaced it. P.S. German officers began to notice something deeply unsettling. P.S. American soldiers did not seem emotionally crushed by losses. P.S. Where German units grew thinner, quieter, more exhausted with each battle, American units seemed to renew themselves. Fresh faces appeared. New equipment arrived. Hot food followed cold nights. Wounded soldiers were evacuated quickly, not left behind. P.S. German soldiers began writing different letters home. P.S. The mocking tone faded. Americans were no longer described as cowards. They were described as strange, reckless, and increasingly dangerous. In Italy, the realization deepened. Mountain fighting favored defenders, and German units expected to bleed American forces dry. Yet Americans kept climbing. They attacked uphill, withdrew, and attacked again. German troops noticed that American soldiers did not treat casualties as failure. They treated them as cost. This mindset disturbed German veterans deeply. The German army fought wars of endurance. It expected enemies to break psychologically. Americans did not. Captured German soldiers began to speak openly. They admitted surprise at American courage. They admitted that Americans fought harder than expected, returned faster than expected, and adapted quicker than expected. One German officer later admitted something chilling. We realized they were learning faster than we can stop them. The greatest shock came when German commanders realized America was not improvising. It was scaling. Every lesson Americans learned was applied everywhere. Tactics improved. Coordination tightened. Firepower increased. The Americans who fought in Normandy were not the Americans first encountered in North Africa. They were sharper, faster, and more confident. German soldiers felt the shift. Battles that once felt controllable became overwhelming. Defensive lines crumbled not because Germans lacked bravery, but because pressure never stopped. There was no pause, no breathing space, no time to recover. German troops learned a new fear: predictability. Americans did not surprise with cunning tricks. They overwhelmed with consistency. When they attacked, support followed. When they paused, reinforcements arrived. When they suffered losses, replacements appeared. A German sergeant wrote after the Normandy landings, "They come again and again. We destroy one unit and another takes its place." The myth of the soft American collapsed completely. German soldiers now understood that wealth had not weakened Americans. It had empowered them. Comfort at home had not made them fragile. It had given them something to return to. And that belief made them fight harder, not softer. By late 1943 and into 1944, German soldiers no longer laughed when Americans were mentioned. They grew quiet instead, because they had learned the truth the hard way. The American soldier was not the enemy Germany expected. He was the enemy Germany had prepared for least. American troops behaved in ways that felt almost offensive to the German military mind. They talked loudly. They joked openly. They argued with officers. They called commanders by their first names. Some even laughed while shells landed nearby. To German soldiers, this was madness. In the Wehrmacht, such behavior would have been punished immediately. Discipline was not optional. It was survival. So when German troops observed American units acting so casually, they assumed it could only mean one thing: weakness. German reports described Americans as undisciplined, chaotic, and careless. Veterans later admitted they believed American soldiers lacked the seriousness required to endure prolonged combat. They expected such troops to break once pressure increased. But once again, reality refused to obey expectations. The first major shock came during American counterattacks. German units would push American forces back, believing the enemy had been shaken. They expected retreat to turn into collapse. Instead, American units regrouped quickly. Junior officers took control without waiting for permission. Sergeants made decisions on their own. Entire platoons adjusted tactics in real time. To German commanders, this behavior was deeply unsettling. The German army relied on structure. Orders were issued carefully and followed precisely. Flexibility existed, but only within limits. American units, by contrast, seemed to operate without visible structure at all. And yet, they worked. German soldiers began to notice a pattern. American troops might appear disorganized at first contact, but once engaged, they reacted fast. If one approach failed, they tried another. If an officer fell, another stepped forward. If communication broke down, they improvised. This adaptability made Americans unpredictable. German doctrine depended on understanding the enemy's behavior. Predictability allowed planning. American soldiers refused to be predictable. They advanced boldly, retreated quickly, then returned with overwhelming support. They probed defenses repeatedly, learning something new each time. German veterans later described Americans as dangerous amateurs, not because they lacked skill, but because they ignored conventions. Another deeply confusing trait was how Americans handled fear. German soldiers were trained to hide fear completely. Showing emotion was weakness. Americans, however, spoke openly about fear. They cursed, they shouted, they joked about death. To Germans, this seemed like psychological collapse, but it wasn't. American soldiers acknowledged fear and kept fighting anyway. This honesty made them resilient. Fear was shared, not suppressed. Losses were mourned openly, not silently absorbed. Morale did not collapse under emotional strain. It adapted. German troops also noticed how Americans treated authority. Officers were respected, but not worshipped. Orders could be questioned. Suggestions were accepted. This flexibility allowed faster decision-making at lower levels, something German units struggled with as casualties mounted. In prolonged engagements, this difference became critical. German units lost experienced officers and NCOs faster than they could replace them. Without leadership, units stalled. American units, by contrast, continued functioning even when leadership was disrupted. German soldiers began to understand something uncomfortable. American lack of rigidity was not a flaw, it was a strength. One German infantryman later wrote, "They did not fight like soldiers trained for obedience. They fought like men trained to survive." This realization spread slowly but decisively. American soldiers were not bound by tradition. They were not trying to prove anything. They were not fighting to uphold an ideology carved in stone. They were fighting to stay alive and return home, and they adapted their behavior accordingly. German commanders increasingly struggled to counter this mindset. Every defensive plan assumed predictable enemy behavior. Americans refused to provide it. They attacked at odd hours. They advanced in unconventional formations. They exploited weaknesses ruthlessly once discovered. Worst of all, they learned. Each engagement made Americans more dangerous. What failed once was not repeated. Mistakes were corrected quickly. German units found themselves facing an enemy that improved faster than they could degrade. By 1944, German soldiers no longer described Americans as undisciplined. They used different words: flexible, relentless, impossible to break. The laughter was gone. In its place was something far more dangerous for German morale. Respect mixed with fear. Because the American soldier was not fighting by the old rules. And against an enemy who refuses to follow rules, even the most disciplined army can begin to fail. German soldiers had always believed that battles were decided by men, by courage, discipline, and tactical skill. Weapons mattered, of course, but only as extensions of the soldier's will. This belief had shaped German military thinking for generations. It was the reason they trusted maneuver over mass, precision over volume, bravery over comfort. That belief began to die the moment American firepower fully entered the war. At first, German units treated American artillery as they would any other. They dug in, calculated distances, and waited for the barrage to lift. In earlier campaigns, artillery fire had been dangerous but limited. Shells came in waves, then stopped. Afterward, infantry followed. With the Americans, it was different. The shelling did not announce itself. It did not slowly build. It arrived suddenly, violently, and with terrifying accuracy. German soldiers later described it as if the ground itself had turned against them. Positions that had been safe minutes earlier were ripped apart without warning. What terrified German troops most was the speed. American forward observers called in fire missions with astonishing efficiency. Adjustments were made almost instantly. If a German unit moved, the shells followed. If it stopped, the fire intensified. There was no time to regroup. No time to think. German veterans recalled a new sensation: helplessness. They were used to fighting an enemy they could see. American artillery was an enemy that struck from nowhere. Men were buried alive. Entire squads vanished in seconds. Communication lines were severed. Leadership disappeared under explosions. And the artillery did not stop. If the shelling paused, it was not relief. It was warning. German soldiers learned that silence often meant something worse was coming. Then came the aircraft. By 1943, American air power dominated the skies. German soldiers could hear engines long before they saw planes. That sound became a signal of fear. Columns froze. Vehicles scattered. Men dove for cover, knowing movement meant death. American fighter bombers attacked relentlessly. Roads became death traps. Supply lines were shattered. Reinforcements arrived late or not at all. Wounded soldiers were trapped because evacuation meant exposure. German soldiers were no longer fighting just the enemy in front of them. They were fighting the sky, the ground, and time itself. One German officer wrote later, "We could no longer move by day. War became something that hunted us." What made this even more devastating was consistency. American firepower was not occasional. It was constant. If one battery fired, another replaced it. If one squadron withdrew, another arrived. There was no sense of exhaustion on the American side. No sense of limits. German soldiers began to understand something terrifying. America was not fighting to win battles. America was fighting to erase resistance. Every American attack felt less like a test of skill and more like an overwhelming process. Defenses were softened, shattered, and then crushed. Survivors were left disoriented, exhausted, and psychologically broken before infantry ever arrived. And when American infantry advanced, they did so with confidence. They knew firepower stood behind them. They knew if resistance appeared, it would be answered immediately. This changed how they fought. They moved aggressively, knowing they were not alone. German soldiers noticed this difference. Their own army increasingly lacked artillery shells, fuel, spare parts. American forces, by contrast, seemed endlessly supplied. Destroyed tanks were replaced. Lost positions were retaken with fresh units. German bravery had not vanished, but bravery alone no longer mattered. One German veteran later admitted, "No courage can stand against endless steel." This realization spread quietly through German ranks. Discussions in dugouts shifted. Confidence faded. Soldiers stopped speaking of victory and began speaking of survival. By Normandy, the lesson was complete. German defenses were strong, expertly prepared, and manned by experienced troops. Yet they were slowly crushed under constant bombardment, air attacks, and relentless pressure. Each day brought fewer supplies, fewer men, and less hope. German commanders understood the truth too late. America's greatest weapon was not the rifle or the tank. It was production. Factories thousands of miles away decided the fate of soldiers on European soil. While Germany counted shells, America counted time, and time was on its side. By the end of 1944, German soldiers no longer spoke of American soldiers as individuals. They spoke of them as a force of nature, unstoppable, unavoidable, exhausting. And once that realization took hold, the war stopped feeling like a contest. It began to feel like an ending. By the final years of World War II, something fundamental had changed inside the German army. The confidence that once filled its ranks had faded, replaced by exhaustion, hunger, and the constant awareness that the war was slipping away. And with that change came a new, uncomfortable truth. German soldiers no longer viewed American troops the way they once had. In the beginning, hatred had been easy. Nazi propaganda had taught German soldiers to despise the Americans. They were portrayed as greedy, immoral, racially mixed, and culturally inferior. This image helped justify the war. It gave German soldiers an enemy they could look down on, an enemy they believed they would eventually defeat. But years of fighting have a way of destroying lies. By 1944, many German soldiers had fought Americans repeatedly across North Africa, Italy, France, and into Germany itself. These encounters forced them to confront reality, not ideology. The first change was subtle. German soldiers noticed that Americans did not behave like conquerors. In captured towns, they distributed food instead of confiscating it. They treated civilians with restraint rather than brutality. This confused German troops, who had been taught that Americans were ruthless and morally corrupt. Then came the treatment of prisoners. Captured German soldiers expected harsh punishment. They had seen how prisoners were treated on the Eastern Front. Many feared execution. Instead, they were searched, fed, given cigarettes, and sent to camps where they survived the war. This experience left a deep impression. German veterans later admitted that American soldiers often showed a strange mix of professionalism and humanity. They fought hard, but once the fighting stopped, cruelty seemed unnecessary to them. This distinction mattered. As the German situation worsened, morale collapsed. Supplies dwindled. Units were under strength. Young boys and old men filled the ranks. American units, by contrast, remained well-equipped and well-fed. German soldiers began to envy their enemy. They noticed American confidence, not arrogance, but certainty. American soldiers believed the war would end. They believed they would go home. This belief gave them strength that German soldiers increasingly lacked. One German infantryman later wrote, "They always spoke of after the war. We stopped doing that." Respect grew slowly, reluctantly. German soldiers acknowledged that Americans were not elite in the traditional sense. They were not obsessed with drill or ceremony, but they were dependable. When ordered to attack, they attacked. When ordered to hold, they held. And when losses occurred, they recovered. The Americans' ability to replace men and equipment created a psychological advantage Germany could not overcome. No victory felt permanent. German soldiers might repel one attack, only to face another the next day, and the next, and the next. This endless pressure wore them down far more than any single battle. Hatred turned into something else. German soldiers began to fear Americans not because they were cruel, but because they were stable, calm, methodical. They did not panic. They did not despair. They advanced with the confidence of men who knew time was on their side. Even in defeat, American soldiers retained dignity. As Allied forces crossed into Germany, many civilians expected atrocities. Instead, they encountered discipline, order, control. For German soldiers watching their homeland collapse, this behavior challenged everything they had been taught. By the final months of the war, many German troops preferred surrendering to Americans rather than continuing to fight, or risking capture by other forces. This choice was not ideological, it was practical. They trusted Americans to keep them alive. This was perhaps the greatest admission of all. Respect did not mean admiration. German soldiers did not suddenly embrace American values, but they recognized competence. They recognized fairness, and above all, they recognized inevitability. One former German officer later summarized it simply: "We lost not because we were cowards. We lost because they could continue and we could not." By the end, Americans were no longer mocked. They were no longer underestimated. They were seen as the soldiers of a nation that had the strength, patience, and will to see the war through to its end. And that realization came too late to change anything. As World War II dragged toward its final brutal years, German soldiers found themselves facing an enemy they no longer misunderstood, but still could not defeat. It was not the American rifle that haunted them most. It was not the tank, the aircraft, or the endless artillery. It was something far less tangible, yet far more powerful. It was the American belief in tomorrow. German soldiers began the war believing that fear, suffering, and sacrifice would break any enemy. That belief had worked before. In Poland, in France, even against the Soviets, fear had been a weapon. But against Americans, fear behaved differently. American soldiers were afraid. German veterans admitted this openly after the war. Americans froze under fire. They shouted, they cursed, they hugged the dirt when shells landed. They were not fearless machines. They were human, and yet they kept moving forward. This contradiction deeply disturbed German troops. In the German army, fear was suppressed. Admitted fear was weakness. Soldiers were trained to internalize terror, to hide it behind obedience and silence. But years of war drained this system. Suppressed fear became exhaustion. Exhaustion became despair. Americans handled fear differently. They talked about it. They joked about it. They cursed it. They shared it. Fear was not hidden, it was released. And because it was released, it did not poison them from within. German soldiers noticed that Americans did not fight like men expecting to die. They fought like men expecting to live. This difference changed everything. American soldiers spoke constantly about home, about families, about farms, factories, and towns thousands of miles away. They counted days. They marked calendars. They planned futures. Even under fire, they believed survival was not just possible, it was likely. German soldiers, by contrast, increasingly stopped speaking of the future. The war had consumed it. One German veteran later wrote, "They fought as if the war was something temporary. For us, it felt endless." This belief gave Americans a psychological armor Germany could not penetrate. When American units suffered losses, they mourned, but they did not surrender hope. New men arrived. Equipment was replaced. Letters from home continued. Music played. Life existed beyond the battlefield. German units, starved of supplies and replacements, felt themselves shrinking, not just physically, but mentally. The Americans always seemed fresh, not because they did not suffer, but because suffering did not define them. Another unsettling realization followed. American soldiers did not hate Germans the way Germans had been taught to hate their enemies. Hatred was not what drove them. Purpose was. Survival was. Return was. German troops expected rage. They expected revenge. Instead, they encountered determination. This emotional neutrality was terrifying. It meant Americans did not need hatred to fight effectively. They did not burn themselves out emotionally. They fought, rested, replaced losses, and fought again. German soldiers began to feel trapped inside a war they could no longer imagine ending. Americans, meanwhile, treated the war as a phase, a terrible one, but finite. Even in the final battles, this difference remained visible. As Allied forces pushed into Germany, American soldiers advanced cautiously but confidently. They did not rush blindly. They did not waste lives unnecessarily. They preserved themselves, because they believed their lives had value beyond the war. This belief shaped their tactics. Firepower was used to reduce risk. Artillery replaced frontal assaults. Air support softened resistance. The goal was not heroic sacrifice. It was efficiency. German soldiers, raised on ideas of honor and endurance, found this deeply unsettling. They had been taught that war was a test of who could suffer more. Americans refused that test. They changed the rules. One former German officer admitted years later, they never tried to prove bravery. They assumed survival was the goal. This mindset made Americans nearly impossible to break psychologically. You could not exhaust them permanently. You could not terrify them into submission. You could not convince them the war was endless, because they knew it was not. And when German soldiers finally surrendered, many felt something unexpected. Relief. Relief not just from fighting, but from fear of the future. They believed Americans would keep them alive. That belief was often correct. In that final realization lay the ultimate defeat. Germany had fought with fanaticism, obedience, and sacrifice. America had fought with confidence, patience, and belief in life after war. In the end, it was not ideology that won. It was tomorrow. German soldiers learned, too late, that an army fighting for survival alone can be worn down, but an army fighting to return home, to life, to family, to peace, can endure almost anything. That was what truly frightened them. Not the American weapon, not the American uniform, but the American certainty that this war would end, and that they would still be alive when it did. And against that belief, Germany had no answer. I hope you can hear that. It's out. Complete. Thank you. Flightning. Being. Thanks.